During the 50s and 60s, movie box office went down by 1/3, which led to movies having smaller budgets and more movies being shot on location. Shooting on location was a better option for saving money when you have a small budget because movie sets cost money, and so shooting in nature was more cost effective. Because of this, a new genre of movies were created, the Western. The Western genre started in America, but after it became successful, it spread to Europe, where Sergio Leone invented the subgenre of Western, spaghetti Western. Among these spaghetti Westerns, Sergio Leone's most famous movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, is the most influential Western ever made because it opened new frontiers in film. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is a part of Sergio Leone's Dollar Trilogy, which is a trilogy of spaghetti Westerns all starring Clint Eastwood, with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly being number 3. Even though The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the third film of the trilogy, it's actually the prequel to The Fistful of Dollars, the first film of the trilogy. Its budget was more than both of the previous movies combined, and it made more than 5 times its budget back at the movie theater. The score of the movie, being one of the most famous parts of it, was done by Ennio Morricone. The director, Sergio Leone, had kept all his ideas about the movie and how to tell the story visually all in his head and never wrote any of them down. But why The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the most influential Western of all time is because its unique script, iconic score, and unforgettable visual style. My first argument is that the score for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is one of the most iconic scores of all time. Proof of this is that it was composed by Ennio Morricone, who's also done the score for movies like The Thing, Once Upon a Time in America, and The Hateful Eight. What makes this score so much more iconic and original than those scores is that The Good, the Bad, and the Uglies was such a new original score. This score was filled with blasting horns, contained many effects like gunfire, chanting, whistling, animal noises, and yodeling. To further prove my claim, the score for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was very successful as a record, making it onto the number 4 spot on the Billboard for pop albums. The score was able to make it on the number 4 spot on the Billboard for 1968 while being a score, so it beat out many actual songs with words like Mr. Robinson by Simon and Garfunkel and Harper Valley PTA, and the songs that beat it were all songs like Hey Jude by the Beatles and Sitting on the Dock of the Bay by Otis Redding. So I doubt that many of you listen to music without words, and you probably never listen or hear scores for movies on the radio, so for a score to be more popular than actual songs is almost unheard of. The score for the movie in the 60s was obviously very popular, but today movies are still copying the score. A very recent example of this is Nope, which even though Nope is a sci-fi horror thriller comedy drama, it does have a lot of similarities to many westerns. But the main example of this, in my opinion, is the end theme for the movie literally rips off The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So this proves that The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly score has had a lasting impact on scores today. Also, the previous films I listed, like The Thing and The Hateful Eight, he all scored later in his career. So this score really launched his career. Before this score, he only had done a very small amount of movies, including the previous 2 Dollar Trilogy. This score made him a well-known composer and one of the most well-known composers of his time, and the score being one of the most iconic of all time. My second argument is that the script for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was groundbreaking because of how it utilized its characters' roles in the movie. The script for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was groundbreaking because of how the 3 main characters are all bad people. The movie is called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly to set up expectations for the main character Joe to be a good person, even though he is basically the equivalent of a con artist but in the Old West. The bad is supposed to be a bad person, which is definitely true because he is a vicious hitman who doesn't let anything get in the way of him murdering people for money. Then they want you to think that the ugly is ugly in his appearance. But besides that, he's more ugly in his personality, shown when he tries to seek revenge on Joe after Joe left him out in the desert to die, so he goes and forces Joe out into the desert to die. But when Joe's on the verge of death, but also gets information about where millions of dollars could be, he immediately goes to save Joe, but not out of the kindness of his heart, but to get information about where millions of dollars could be. The script, if you compare to other Western movies, specifically American Westerns, were very different. The American Western had very good main characters who never really did anything wrong and always easily killed the bad guy, who was very bad and only did bad things for no clear reason. There's also the aspect of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly relating to the Civil War that compares the Union to the Confederates. Even though the Union was fighting for a stronger cause, the movie looks at the war in general as a wrong course of action, shown with the Union leader who's just there because he has to be there and just drinks all day. Then later the Confederate soldier and the ruined building laying there suffering, about to die. The movie doesn't portray him as an evil, horrible person, but someone who had to go to war. You can compare this to There Will Be Blood, a 2007 Western that was directed by Paul Thomas Anderson. This movie was likely influenced by The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly because of the fact that it's a Western with major themes of greed and betrayal and has a main character who's a horrible person who greedily goes out onto the American frontier to look for oil so he can become rich. Another famous Western is No Country for Old Men, which also came out in 2007, which also is likely inspired by The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, because another theme in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is moral standards, which is deeply explored in No Country for Old Men. No Country for Old Men also has its two main characters fighting over money. Other Westerns from the time of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, like several of the John Wayne films, have had no impact on Westerns today because no Westerns are made like that today. They're all just like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. My third argument is that The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly's visual style has affected almost every single Western from today's visual style. The look and visual style of the movie was very unique from other Westerns of its time when compared to other earlier Westerns like The Searchers. The Searchers, an earlier Western from America, is known for being one of the best Westerns out there. One key difference between the two are the visuals. The Searchers is very clean and precise in visuals, unlike The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly that has very dirty, dry, gritty visuals and cinematography. It has super close-ups that are now used all the time in movies, and the contrast of this between the terrain around the people is what distinguishes the style of this movie from every other Western of its time. New Westerns don't look technicolored like The Searchers. They look gritty and dirty like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Even though there are obvious differences between newer Westerns and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, like giant air shots, they are very similar in style. Even the movie Nope, which I already said is debatably not even a Western, has some noticeable similarities in style to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You could debate that almost any other movie is more influential than The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, because thousands of movies come out every year, but The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly did have to stem from somewhere, so a lot of older movies you could debate are more influential than The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You could also say that Citizen Kane is more influential because of how the way it's lit, or how it's shot. You could also argue that The Wizard of Oz is more influential because it proved that if a movie had color, people could go see it, making color very popular in movies. Same could go for Jurassic Park being the first movie to show what CGI could really do. And if we didn't have Jurassic Park, then we wouldn't have all our huge big budget movies constantly using CGI like Avatar or Star Wars. But many people would actually argue that The Searchers is the most influential Western. The New York Times Magazine cited from Ernest Hemingway, all American literature can be traced back to one book, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. And something similar might be said for American cinema and The Searchers. It has become one of those movies that you see in part through movies that came after it, and that show traces of its influence. Apocalypse Now, Punch Drunk Love, Kill Bill. The Searchers also had a very racist and bad main character, which The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly also had a very bad main character. But The Searchers came earlier, so you can infer that Sergio Leone admired The Searchers. Even though The Searchers had some aspects that The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly might have stolen, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly made its style of the spaghetti western popular, shown with all the newer westerns I talked about earlier. And movies like The Searchers don't really get made anymore, because all the westerns now are like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The movie Power of the Dog, No Country for Old Men, and There Will Be Blood all have copied the visual style and cinematography of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And also, the New York Times Magazine that stated that The Searchers was the most influential movie of all time, their main argument that the final shot was iconic. And even though the final shot of the movie is very iconic and has been copied a lot, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly also doesn't have any specific shot like The Searchers that's super iconic, it's just one shot in the entire entire movie. In conclusion, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is a prime example of a Western movie opening frontiers in film by popularizing the anti-hero, changing what normal average scores sounded like in Westerns, and creating its own visual style that has been replicated in every single Western today.